Thank you. Well, it's a very great honor for me to be with you this evening. For me, it's a kind of return to the source. Because when I was a child, I lived, let's say after I was 10 years old, I lived down the block from the Theosophy Center in New York. Now, realize that I was a child who was somewhat theologically precocious, but I was saddled with one parent who was an agnostic Baptist and the other who was a Sicilian Catholic with leanings towards Christian Science. And between them, I couldn't find one decent conversation about philosophy, myth, transformation. My father found anything I came up with very funny, and my mother kept handing me a rosary and Mary Baker Eddy's Key to the Scriptures. So I used to haunt the Theosophical Society's library, and they were very kind and let me go there. And there I essentially got my start. Now that I was just thinking, I got my start in thinking about issues of philosophy, symbology, myth, and the great perennial themes that inform and evoke the human spirit. So I'm very, very grateful to be here. When I was about 4.5 years old, my father, a comedy writer, brought me to the MGM studios in Hollywood where he was working on a film. I believe it was one of the Road series. My dad worked for Bob Hope. Do any of you remember the Road series? The Road to Bali and the Road to thing. And as we were making our way into the middle of the studio, the producer of the film, who I remember as being a very short, very fat man, very rotund, with bright yellow pants, came to us and he said to my father, "Now, Jack, come to my office. We got to discuss that scene." And my father leaned over to bring me along. He said, "Leave the kid behind, Jack. I hate kids." And my father was very worried. And I said, "Oh, that's okay, Daddy," having just seen Roy Rogers ride by on Trigger. And so my father gave me a lollipop. He said, "Well, that's okay, kid. You sit there, and I'll be back in no time." Well, no time turned out to be 2 hours, as we know time. But it actually turned out to be no time at all. Because in that 2 hours, the entire collective unconscious of the human race went by. I remember scooting over as Marie Antoinette and the entire French court went by, with ball gowns and great, wigs, and I noted that Marie was wearing tennis shoes. And then I looked across, and out of the commissary was becoming Julius Caesar, who was eating a hot dog. And then suddenly, here comes the French Foreign Legion on camels. And on the other side comes Sabu. Do any of you remember the Hindu actor Sabu on an elephant? Well, the camel spit. I won't tell you what the elephant did, but it didn't smell too good. And Sabu shouted words in English I'd never heard before. It was very impressive. And then suddenly over there was a group of cannibals with bones in their noses, and they were making their way to the men's room, only to be stopped by the Empress of China, who told them it was out of order. Well, I looked up and down the street for my dad, but he wasn't there. But I did see a midget left over from the Wizard of Oz pushing a baby carriage. Now, if you're 4.5 years old and you see a midget pushing a baby carriage, what are you going to do? You're going to follow her. So I did. And she turned the corner, and suddenly we were in ancient Israel, where Salome was playing poker with some of the 12 disciples on the table of the Last Supper. Judas was evidently winning, judging from what he was raking in. Well, I walked through the open door of the Roman Forum, past the statue of Jupiter and Venus, to find myself in a cardboard English village of Shakespeare's time. And I remember that fake swans were floating in some thick soup that was supposed to be the river Avon, but which had old bottles of knee-high orange floating in it. I turned a corner to find a knight in armor taking a snooze between the paws of a great sphinx, while across the way Jesse James was ambling through a mock-up Mayan temple. Then it really got interesting. A fight broke out in the Dodge City Saloon, And I moved closer to watch it, only it was a funny kind of fight because one man was picking up a chair, hitting the other man over the head with it, picking up another chair again, over and over. The other cowboys were reading Variety, and I tugged on the skirt of the lady who was playing Belle Starr, and I said, why is that man hitting that man over and over like that? She said, shh, honey, this is a shoot. Is your ma one of the dancing girls? I don't think so. Well, you better get out of here. So I wandered off quite literally into a sunset. In this case, a painted set of vibrant colors, again, left over from the Wizard of Oz. And I fell asleep, and a man in a monkey suit finally found me. And he took me halfway, where I was met by Flora Robeson, dressed as Mrs. Martha Washington, who told me in tones worthy of the mother of the country, your father is looking for you. And she took me to my dad, who picked me up, swung me around, and said, hey, kid, did Jack the Ripper find you? No, no, Daddy, Mrs. Washington did. Oh, well, that's better. Daddy, I said, what are those words that are on your door? What does that spell? He said, well, now, kid, your mom's been teaching you to figure out letters. You figure it out. Well, that's a D, the R, dreamland. Why do you call your office Dreamland, Daddy? Because that's where we are, kid. That's where we are. Now, that was Hollywood in the 1940s. The back lot, as I suggested, of the collective history and the collective unconscious of the human race. They made, in MGM alone, over 360 pictures a year. It was also a prefigural event in fantasy of what was soon to become my reality. What do I mean by this? Well, in the last several years or so, I sometimes have felt as if I have been walking and often living in God's own back lot. I have swum in the Ganges, and if you really must know, tried to avoid a wave of ashes with what I thought was a cow leg. It wasn't. I have followed a former president and his wife in Plains, Georgia, into their home as they showed me how they carved their own furniture. I've walked through a jungle in South America and seen a nearly naked man come out of the forest with a transistor radio clapped to his ears, listening to the latest gold quotations from London, I imagine. I have planted rice with farmers in the middle of China and then been taken to their homes where I have seen them take down the picture of Mao Zedong and put up the picture of the whole earth seen from outer space. I have been taught ancient dances by lepers in the middle of Africa and then had to teach them in return disco dancing. I have followed Aboriginal women in the center of Australia as they showed me how to find food. How can you find food? And it's so barren, this landscape. Hey, what's that, mate? You don't see the beautiful food all around here? Well, no. Well, look here, look at these grasses. Now, sip the sweet resin. And look over there, there. Now, there's going to be a sinkhole there, and under that you're going to find a beautiful tuber, sure enough. And you see that rock? Oh, look, delicious white mealy grubs. Oh, what a nice feast we're going to have, you know. And the following week, I've discussed international cuisine with Julia Child at a hot dog contest on Wall Street. I've found myself in the middle of India, in a little village on Sunday. When all of India closes down on Sunday, each town, each little village has one television set, and everybody comes and sits on the ground and watches the Ramayana, the great, epic, gorgeous story of Prince Rama, who is really Vishnu, the incarnation of Vishnu, as he tries to save his wife Sita, who has been abducted by the demons. And this gorgeous, gorgeous performance with these elaborate costumes and magnificent, great prose and poetry and beautiful dances. And then the old lady sitting next to me on the ground says, "Oh, I don't like Sita." What? No, she is too passive. No, we women in India, we're much stronger than that. We've got to change the story. She said, "My name is Sita, my husband's name is Rama, very common in India, he's a lazy bum. I got to change the story." And then I was mortally embarrassed when Do you know what followed the Ramayana on television? Hundreds of millions of Indians watching? Dynasty. And the lady saw how embarrassed I was. She said, "Oh, sister, don't be embarrassed. It is the same story." I said, "What?" Yeah, you got the good lady, you got the bad lady, you got the good man, you got the bad, you got the beautiful clothes, you got the beautiful house, you got the people flying through the air, you got the good versus evil. Oh, yes, indeed, it is the same story. Of course, she's right, you see. You had the Teilhard's noosphere in a very interesting form, you know. I've dived within science fiction landscapes at the Great Coral Reef. I've climbed the Anasazi cliff homes, and I've rafted over waterfalls in Indonesia. I've made myself plastic and pliable as a tiny little woman molded my body into the forms of the ancient Balinese dance. I've seen trance dancers in Yogyakarta become horses and chew flowers and grass and nails and fall on their swords with no apparent harm. And I've seen traders in Japan in the stock market scream themselves into a frenzy that recalled their samurai ancestors. I have watched people die and people be born, both literally and spiritually, on every continent of the globe. And I have seen the dreams of millennia become real and the realities of the last 100 years fade away into dreams. The sets that I walked through as a small child and the life that I now live were, I believe, fractal waves of the same configuration rolling through my earlier and my later life. And these in turn were part of the larger wave that has happened the world over, wherein the dream becomes the reality and the reality becomes the dream. What are fractals? Magnificent concept. Fractals are repetitions of the same patterns, even to some extent the same details at both ascending and descending scales. They are infinitely folded. Consider a coastline. You have the great coastline. Then as you get closer, you see the wave forms, and then the little tiny wave eddies, smaller and smaller, repeating the patterns of the larger. Consider the blood supply of your own bodies. At first glance, the veins and the arteries with the repeated branching may appear chaotic, but looked at in more detail, it becomes clear that the same complex branching is repeated for smaller and smaller blood vessels right down to the capillaries. The same is true of a mountain. The fact is that the complex system of nature and time in nature seems to preserve the look of their detail at finer and finer scales. The question of the fractal nature of reality comes up when we look through the electronic microscope and we see the same patterns as we see in the telescopes of things that are 100 light years across. One is clearly the fractal resonance of the other. Or to put it another way, it would appear that principles of growth and form are the same, even though they are operating at different scales. The life of the Hollywood set that I walked through as a child was of a similar order of fractal resonance, a lesser waveform of the life that I live today. And in fact, if I were asked to ask you, in fact, you may want to do this when you go home, to consider certain basic patterns. Now, I mean the creative patterns, what I would call the entelechy patterns, the dynamic, purposeful patterns of your life. You may see that, in fact, that they, like fractal forms, that they are repeated. And in fact, part of our possibility, of our own illumination, may have to do with riding the nested temporal resonance, finding the fractal wave as it appears again, what I call kairos, the loaded time, or kairotic, the passion of the loaded time, which often appears as a kind of fractal wave in our lives. And to know it as our possibility, because it may very well be that time is not just some epiphenomenon through which space endures. Time, as many physicists are considering now, time in fact may be elemental. It may have real structure. And these structures, as I suggest, and point is I will suggest in the next book that the Quest books are publishing, Life Force, where I in fact show how the fractal waves of one's own individual growth repeat certain fractal waves in cultural development. Now these waves, when you learn to ascertain their coming, can be enormous, what should we say? They can provide tremendous impetus for the passion of our own becoming. and I will refer to this throughout. So I feel that the understanding of the fractal wave form and morphic resonance, time, and the nature of time is more rightly seen as a flow pattern in a dynamical system. And what I was describing as my early dreamlike experience and my later temporal reality were resonances of the same time wave. And I think that it is in the understanding of the nature of this time wave that we begin to understand the underlying dynamics that drives what is happening today in America and the world, which is simply whole system transition. Everything is happening now. I realize other times in history thought they were it. They're wrong. This is it. This is it. This is big time fractal wave resonance. Now let's take this for a moment out of the personal and put it into the universal. That is, how to understand the very nature of the transition, which is the bringing in of a certain critical threshold of novelty into time to effect a waveform of history through greater and greater levels of fractal branching and integration. Let's go back to the beginning. In the beginning, all is chaos. The universe's early moments are ones of total chaos. Temperature is simply too high to allow for bonding. There is only a plasma of charged particles. As it cools, a whole system transition occurs and bonding on an atomic level becomes possible, with atomic systems coming into being, which indicate a new and refined level of organization. This waveform of organization finds its temporal resonance billions of years later as the cooling continues and the waveform of Genesis moves further and further away from its center, and molecular systems and stellar dust and star systems and organizations of large aggregates of matter expand outward from the waveform of being. Then there occurs an even more elaborate phase transition at the crest of a new wave, which represents a quantum leap in complexity. It is called life. So you see, with each of these whole system transitions, there's an acceleration of the appearance of new forms and the speeding up of the occurrence of these forms, so that we could say that for all practical purposes, in the first half of the history of the universe, almost nothing happened. Virtually everything occurred in the last half, the second half of the life of the universe. Several billion years ago, life appeared. 70 million years ago, mammalian life appeared at the close of the dinosaur age, stimulated, we believe, by a wave of comets coming too close to the Earth. 30 to 50,000 years ago, although it's being pushed backwards, forms of human culture appeared. 5 to 10,000 years ago, elaborate forms of conceptual speculation, mathematics, astronomy, agriculture, architecture. 500 years ago, the insights of Leonardo da Vinci, which means the understanding of perspective, gave us a totally radical new notion of where we are in space and time. What do I mean by that? Well, think of art before Leonardo. Leonardo wrote a tremendous monograph on perspective. And suddenly everybody said, oh my God, perspective. Before that, a great deal of painting looked like what? And then, of course, you have depth. Music sounded like la la, ah, and suddenly with the Renaissance music and perspective, you have rum ba 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 bum ba bum bum rum ba 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 bum 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 bum. Polyphony in many forms, polyphony in perspective abounding. Leeuwenhoek looking for perspective in the micro world. Galileo, Copernicus, Kepler, macroscopic seeing of the depths of the outward, the macro world. You have lace discovered, texture, Vesalius finding the levels and levels and levels within the body. Columbus discovering with Magellan and Vasco da Gama intercontinental space. Oh, Michelangelo, the Duomo, the great spatial patterns in architecture. And of course, what happened with this is that there was an extraordinary acceleration of space as people migrated all over as crashing waves into each other. All parts of the planets caught all parts of the planet. And when in this century electronic circuitry emerged so that we could, through computers, join to planetary perspectives, join to scholarship which harvested the social and the political and the spiritual and the artistic and the psychological patterns of all the peoples from all times, we found ourselves where we are today, in an incredible compression of all of the waveforms that ever were and perhaps ever will be, hitting the shore of a now that has become the hologrammatic compression of the universe itself. And it is in this state of hologrammatic compression and all these fractal waves of all and everything hitting the shore of the now that has effected the whole system transition and the radical uniquenesses that are happening in history. When I was about 19, I was at Union Theological Seminary, and our great teacher that year, our special teacher, was Dr. Paul Tillich, the great German theologian. And he had a certain word that he used in describing his systematic theology, which not one of us understood. The word was wak-wum. How many of you know this story? That's all. Thank God I can get away with it. Okay. Wak-wum. When we tried to figure out what is a wak-wum, and so we theological students would meet every afternoon and discuss wak-wum. And we finally created a great body of work about the wak-wum, the epistemology of wak-wum, the phenomenology of wak-wum, the existential structuralism of wak-wum. We got Germanic, the Heilsgeschichte of wak-wum, the Ursprung of wak-wum. And finally, at the end of this course, they asked me to ask the great man a question. So I raised my hand. Yes, Miss Houston. Professor Tillich. Yes, Miss Houston, what is it? Professor Tillich, and I looked around at the hundreds of older and wiser male graduate students, and I forgot my question. Yes, Miss Houston, what is it? Professor Tillich, so I asked a question of blithering naivete. How do you spell wak-wum? Yes, Miss Houston, wak-wum. And he spells on the board vacuum. And we think, oh, right. The basis of all and everything, the wak-wum. I mean, if you take, for example, the hard part of the molecular structure, the hard part of the atom, and you get rid of the wak-wum, you know, and you take all these hard parts and you put them together of everybody on this planet, you know what you've got in matter? A very heavy grain of rice. The rest of it is wak-wum, right? Now, the problem is, what's in a wak-wum? They say nature abhors the wak-wum. So what is it? Is it God? Is it evolutionary patterns yearning at the threshold of time and space to enter into time? Is it mind at large? Is it the depths that are always rising? In point of fact, when we lose our surfaces of things through love, through rapture, through madness, through creativity, through unitive experience, are we falling into the wak-wum? Is the wak-wum rising into us? I personally think that we tend to pathologize when we should be mythologizing, and that there should be halfway houses for wak-wum fallers. No, this is very serious. I mean, it's funny, but it's something that the Theosophical movement has always understood. They have understood the liminality of our existence and how we are only a submolecular psychic weave away from the depths at any particular moment. And that either through original grace or just plain luck, the depths are always at hand. And that in fact that the whole Theosophical movement has provided an extraordinary theological as well as a cosmological and philosophical base for understanding these things. And would that that had informed so much of our psychological processes rather than the materialistic assumption that we are encapsulated bags of skin dragging around a dreary little ego. But in point of fact, we are organism environments symbiotic with fields within fields within fields with life, and ultimately with the wak-wum, that the depths are within us. So that we are in this time of this extraordinary fractal wave when literally these depths are rising. in which it looks like total and complete chaos and madness, but it literally is the reformation of all and everything because of these depths. Factors absolutely unique in human history are happening that I think are not simply some kind of evolutionary pattern. It is something much deeper. It belongs to the kairos of the time. It is the depths rising. For example, we are in our time on the verge, on the very eve of planetary civilization. It does not mean planetary culture. It is not a planetary culture. If anything, cultures are becoming more so. They are not becoming less. I've just returned last month from New Zealand, where we worked with at all levels of government and with many, many, many Maoris and Maori societies. The Maoris are recapturing their culture, their art, their music, their history. They're getting their land back. They're getting their fishing rights back. Something like this is happening the world over. We have come to the end of the trashing of indigenous cultures. And it is a strange and remarkable phenomenon that nobody is writing about. Part of my job in the world, as I see it, is in what we try to do, is that we are called in by international agencies to help cultures preserve themselves while they move into the next century. And what we find is this phenomena, is that these cultures are rising the world over. Why? I keep asking myself, why is this happening? It's unique in history. And I think the reason is, and I'm going to offer a theological speculation, as we lose species, and as you know, we lose about one species every 25 minutes, it is almost as if nature herself, in her grand design, is activating new species in the form of both the preservation of culture and the development of many new cultures. It is as if the earth needs the cultures as her organ systems as we begin to move into this new order of international civilization, which I think is inevitable, and I believe will be in place by the end of the 21st century. So, I mean, and part of this, of course, is what happened in 1969. In one of my earlier incarnations, meaning in 1970, you laugh. How many incarnations have you had in this life when you really think about it? I was asked by NASA to help astronauts try to remember what they saw on the moon. Because, you know, they couldn't remember very much. They had too many things to do. And they'd go around in these big suits, say, okay, Houston, not this one, you know, the city, you know. And so I was to help them try to remember what they saw peripherally. Well, I tried everything. I taught them meditation. We did active imagination. I had them draw things. I even taught them to pray, for God's sakes. Right. Finally, I yelled at them. That's what worked, yelling at them. And finally, Ed Mitchell said, Gene, the problem is that you simply are asking the wrong question. It is not what we saw on the moon. It's what we saw coming back to Earth that was important. Because coming back, floating downhill, as it were, we had very little to do. And we would look out through the window and we would see this beautiful, beautiful. He says, you cannot imagine how beautiful it is. No picture can do it justice. This blue and silver planet floating in the great ocean of being. And he said, and my hand happened to hit the stereo button and the music of Camelot came on. Can you see it? The earth coming up. Da-dum, da-da-da-da, da-da-da-da-da, da-dum, da-da-da-da-da. Camelot, which of course was about the once and future kingdom of Arthur's kingdom, and here was the once and future earth. He said, I felt such nostalgia for what we could be. I went up there an astronaut. I came back a psychonaut, devoted to inner space. All of them were changed. I mean, lunacy is no mere metaphor, you know. They touched back and they came back. They had been born. Talk about born again. This was born again. Been born out of the womb of the earth as her fetus and had come back as her co-partner, and that is where we are. In this extraordinary state of co-partnering the planet. That's what I mean by type 1 high-level civilization. It is when we come back as stewards, as co-creators of the evolutionary and the biological process. Now what this did is it changed everything. Or if you will, it accelerated. It allowed the Wakum to rise into the second phase that has, again, is systemic throughout the planet, is causing tremendous problems and extraordinary growth. And that is, quite simply, the rise of women to full partnership with men over the whole domain of human affairs. It's happening. It's hell on wheels. Men and women don't know how to talk to each other anymore, because what do you do after thousands of years of certain kinds of expectations are lifted? At the same time, the rich mind style of women, gestated in the womb of time over millennia, is rising. An emphasis on process rather than on product. An emphasis on making things cohere, happen, grow, the symbiosis of things. This is also releasing men to become what they really can be. It is the end of the traditional polarization of roles and of understandings. And I think it is deepening the understanding of womanhood and manhood. But it is very, very difficult now. I think philosophically, in the dialectic between logos and eros, where logos is mastery and control and eros is symbiosis, there perhaps is a greater rise of eros. In the philosophical principle about inner and outer space, I think subjective and intuitive knowing, the understandings that you have from your extraordinary plenum of hooks and eyes to pick up the pluriverse. Because, you know, we have not just 5 senses, we have perhaps 200. And women, with the emphasis on making things cohere, grow, have developed so many of these extraordinary subtle ways of knowing, that this emphasis on the ecology of inner space is also developing in ways that it never could before. It is fascinating to me that when you study the development of what Robert Elwood in his wonderful book, Alternate Alters, has spoken of, that in America, and especially in the Theosophical movement, you have the appreciation of a feminine leadership that has led to an extraordinary emphasis and understanding of the dynamics of inner space and the importance of each individual's tremendous capacity to tune into the beyond within, the spiritual continuum, which is part of each part of us. And this is something that you find throughout the Theosophical movement. You certainly find it in Christian Science and some of the new thought processes, as well as many others. But Theosophy has led the way in this understanding of the spiritual dimensions that have been nurtured by the appreciation of the feminine nature of God and the feminine nature of creativity. Now, another aspect that is rising in our time is, of course, the fact that we are incredibly interdependent. We have become a planet of colossal busybodiness. I have a hobby. It's a wonderful hobby. When I'm home, I try to do it. I'm on the computer networks with different names. Late at night, you know, I'm talking to everybody. Well, I won't tell you what my name is because I won't tell you that one. But on one, I'm a 15-year-old boy talking to other 15-year-old boys, playing Dungeons and Dragons, who think I'm a 15-year-old boy with a weird vocabulary. On another, I was known as the Queen of Comedy because I inherited my father's joke collection. On another, I'm myself talking with the Green Party and the ecology movement all over the world simultaneously. But what we are in this world of this complex interaction is we have literally come into Teilhard's noosphere. Now, what this is going to mean and what this is going to do for the radical democratization of the world, and what it will mean in terms, I will make certain suggestions. Because of this extraordinary interconnectivity, I will suggest that within 10 years, most governments will have a third house of governance. You'll have the equivalent in your parliaments of your Senate and your Congress, House of Representatives, but you will also have a third house which will be the ombudsman for the earth. The people who speak for the total whole. You can't put that bridge in. You can't put that nuclear plant here. Look what it will do to China. So that you will have this systemic understanding and appreciation that will go into every major political act. So that is one thing that will happen. As a result of this, I think we're going to have countries in which there are nothing, like Chad. Try Chad if you want to see nothing. The utter wasteland, becoming the place where we put our think tanks, our great universities, so that nothing is wasted. Because of this, what we're going to see is not only multiculturalism, but we are also going to see people appreciating and making use of the ecology of cultures. This leads to my next point, which is the revolution in the understanding of human capacities, the harvest of the understanding of different ways and means and styles of being human, the genius, the sheer genius that has developed in different sectors of the earth is now coming home, literally, not to roost, but to develop. So that, for example, well, I'll give you an example because this has been part of my work. There are a few societies that have no history of war or neurosis as we understand it. I've studied some of them. One of them is in West Africa, surprisingly. When you go to that particular society and you try to understand how it works, you ask them to solve a problem. Well, they don't solve a problem the way we do. What's that? A, yes, subsection B, C, part 1. No, not at all. First, they dance it. You know, that wonderful chicken dance. Then they sing it. Hi-yi-la-yay-yay. Well, you do it with me. Hi-yi-yay-yay. Hi-yi-yay-yay. And then they dance, and they dance some more, and then they close their eyes, and they envision it, and then they dream it, and then they talk about it, then they dance some more, then they've all got the solution. Now you may say that would not work in our government or our universities. And you'd be wrong. Because simply what they were doing is bringing in more frames of mind. We are living in the last age of the Holocaust of the psyche and of the mind. Because we are in the last age of this radical insularity of styles and ways of knowing. I have never met a stupid child. I've met incredibly stupid, diminishing and reductionist systems of education, which does not honor the inherent genius in every child. Do you see? And this is, of course, and I'm going to get into this now, this is something that is really changing the very style and way of being human, so that this extraordinary wave of the depths, the rising of the depths of the vacuum, means that time and culture and information and new ways of being are flowing into the present standing wave hologram of the now, this present epoch. And this standing wave sucks up the deeper currents into itself in order to sustain itself. And these deeper currents may be the very waveforms of the mind of God, who started it all in the first place. The fractals of spirit, if you will, the implicate order of being itself, which always rises at critical time vectors, what I'm calling kairos times, to energize the phase transitions in the world of space and time. So this is being experienced as the rising of the depths, the radical metaphysical reconstruction of what we think of as reality, the reinvention, the regenesis of ourselves, with a lot of help, of course, the fascination with myth, the seeking of spiritual experience, in some places, the archaic revival of shamanic knowings, a world music, fascinating, which incorporates and sustains the rhythms of many regions, the clothing that mixes and matches continents on a single body. I mean, I think of myself, my dress is from Morocco, my shoes are from Finland, my watch is from Australia, I'm wearing under here, but you can't see, a medal from ancient Greece. One ring is from New Mexico, my underwear, like yours, is from Taiwan. But my mind, like yours, also has this strange ecological mixture, doesn't it? And so on the shadow side, of course, the rising for a last stand of the old tribal gods in their varying fundamentalist posture, before they too are swept, not away, never away, nothing is ever lost, that's part of the problem, but into a new amalgam in which they become part of a larger story. The dream of the depths, which is dreaming itself into life, becomes the nature of this changing reality. And the equation between the two is sustained by certain wave rhythms and drives that allow for the dream to enter into time for the currents to sustain the standing wave that is moving into the transition. Now, before I go into what are the requirements for this to happen, let me just say something about the psyche of America. America was founded not just by a few hundred years of some millions of frustrated Europeans. America was founded by the eschatological hopes of millions of people over thousands of years in longing for that western land beyond the waters, where it was thought, and this is mythically, you find it all over the world, where it was thought that one would find paradise, or the kingdom of God upon the earth, or the opportunity and the possibility for really exploring one's humanhood that hitherto one thought one could find only in paradise. Now, this is an enormously heavy fact of our existence, and perhaps, in fact, it accounts for our relative blessedness compared to other nations, in that the psyche, the very psyche of America, and I happen to believe that nations have psyches as much as people do, or let's say morphic fields of resonance, that this psyche is enormously compacted, energized, and has a lot more in it than we have given it credit for, because due to the fact that America rose at the same time as the Industrial Revolution, further, boom, 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 we objectified too quickly. We tapped into what was there of that psychic template for art, religion, culture, transformation. We objectified our manifest destiny too soon, and we did not tap deep enough until perhaps today. I think what we have seen, excuse my saying so, in the recent media blitz and presidential election was the last stand of the old Industrial Revolution, where people are speaking not to the deeper message, but are speaking only for the surface of the media. I once had this discussion with President Carter, and one of the things I said to him was, Mr. President, part of the problem was that our presidency died with Mr. Nixon and Watergate. And then when you came along with your extraordinary vision, the presidency was already in a state of rigor mortis. And then we got the actor playing the president. You see. I won't say anything about anybody else, but what I'm saying is that what we have seen is the demythologizing, because we did not tap into the politeia, the deep, communal, political, dynamic, mythic possibility of America. Now, I don't know what's going to happen on Tuesday, but the point is that what has happened is with the demythologizing of our political life, and it becoming a kind of grand guignol or situation comedy, it is as if the energy has moved elsewhere. Into what? Into music, sometimes into art, and I suspect into a whole new order of natural philosophy, of which you find a very strong current in the Theosophical movement. More of this later. Now, we are moving into transition, and the requirement is that systemic change is always driven by a certain level of stimulation, resulting in the raising of the levels of chaos, which we're seeing today, certainly, followed by a raising of the imagination and then of creativity. How many of you believe that you are now at a high level of chaos? How many of you find yourself becoming much more imaginative as a result of this? No, this is a real question. I'm just curious. Yes. How many of you find yourself haunted by the hound of heaven every morning? Woof, woof, woof. Get up. Get on with it. Come on. Wake up, stupid. Let's get going. How many of you have the hound of heaven yapping? How many of you have become interested in myth or philosophy or religion or symbolic structures, whether you want to or not, that they are there? That's the raising of the level of the imagination, which always follows upon the raising of the level of chaos, because that's also the vacuum. The depths are rising. Physicist Ilya Prigogine, who of course provided us with a model which has been found to be remarkably applicable to virtually all situations of change and transition, so much so that he's embarrassed by it. put it at its simplest, it states that the more complex a structure, the more energy it must use, the word he uses is dissipate, to maintain all that complexity. This flux of energy then makes the system highly unstable, subject to internal fluctuations and sudden change, if you will, creatively neurotic. Now, if these fluctuations reach a critical size, they are amplified by the system's many interconnections and then can drive the system into a new state, which is even more ordered, coherent, and connected. The new state, whoop, occurs as a sudden shift. I believe that this is true of not only of molecules, which he was studying, but also cities, planets, people, and theologies. And so to me, all of this suggests that the growth of a culture or consciousness, the very stuff of the current whole system transition, is being encouraged by a rhythm of dynamic input which will be followed by coherence. And that what is happening in the current chaos in America is that the chaos is causing the depths of what had been there in the psychic template of America to arise. And we're going to see some fascinating changes in the next 10 years. Artistic, philosophical, theological, and psychological changes that are totally unanticipated as of now. So the more complex a system, meaning you and me, the more capacity it has for interaction with other systems, the more waves of information and energy it requires. When before have you required so much energy and information? How many of you cannot pass any bookstore, I mean not the lowliest drugstore shelf, without wandering over and saying, is truth here, or is it here, or is it here? How many of you are truly pathetic and neurotic truth seekers? And that is, of course, the requirement for that certain level of information to begin to sustain the creativity. When you come back with your next load of books and your relatives complain, saying, no, I am merely sustaining my growing complexity. You see, and that will work. So on the human scale, as it is, the more experiences we have, and it has been fairly reliably ascertained that most of us have somewhere between 5 and 10 times the amount of sheer experience than our ancestor of 100 years ago. And of course, there was many events between Christ's time and the year 1914 as there were between 1914 and today. And this, of course, is fractally then present as also a wave of accelerating experience in our own lives. Well, the problem, of course, is that with so much experience, our own mores, values, and ethics, our ways of being, have not kept pace with our experience. So most of us end up very wounded, don't we? I mean, all of us here are perhaps so full of holes that we've become holy, you know. But we've also become available, vulnerable, to other people, to empathic knowings with other people, to a lack of fear, to a remarkable lack of fear that you don't find in other societies, because we have become, as it will, blown through, available, vulnerable, and thus co-creative. So the more experiences we have, the more ideas we have. And that then changes the brain. It grows dendritic structures. I do not believe this is the same brain it was 100 years ago. The more information and greater accessibility to experience and reflection upon this experience we then are likely to make. This then puts us in touch with our own depths, which in turn enables us to respond more and more to the larger quantum resonance of the cosmos in such a way as to bring these wave forms of holonomic information back into the world of space and time. Many of you are familiar, and certainly in our own laboratory we have pursued this, about how in states of deep meditation you can actually see what is called macrophagic wave transition. Thus, if I were to hook up each one of you in a certain way, let's say with 8 channels of EEG, we'd hear, that's not what you'd hear, but that's the idea. But if you got into a state of rapture, or unity, or high creativity, or deep meditation, or deep contemplative reflection, what we would then hear is suddenly the equivalent of This would then recruit other brain areas. I'm sorry I have to use these sounds, but English just doesn't hold it. And before you know it, you would be in that state of a kind of meditative resonance in which you would then be resonant to, what should we say, the field of mind at large. It is in such states that the mystics or the high creatives enter into the very nature of creativity itself, into the very great patterns of connection, into the archetypal images of the way things work, into the source level of patterns, and come back with inventions, with ideas, with possibilities that often change the world. Thus, Francis of Assisi, one of the most disorganized human beings who ever lived, enters into phase transition, into macrophasic wave transition, and comes back with a knowledge and a way of being that changes the moral system of Europe. Teresa of Avila, a nut by any contemporary standards. She would never have gotten past her 11th year in our society without being kept on Ritalin or Valium. Thank God they were born in other times, you see, where people mythologize them rather than pathologize them. But she enters into these profound states. We won't even begin to discuss Madame Blavatsky, who would have had a horrendous time, and who some of you would not have had in your home, if the truth be told. I mean, so radically innovative a being was she, but she would have been very embarrassing, because she was liminal and always living at an extraordinary intellectual and social edge. Well, these people, you see, would enter then into these states of deep resonance, and they would come back with the extraordinary pattern of ideas that then could be lensed through their particular skills in the world of space and time that would then green the local wasteland. So Mozart, a very silly man by all local accounts, would enter into these states and enter into the realm of music, and they said, Salieri would say to him, how could such a silly little man like you write such extraordinary divine music? And Mozart would say, ha ha, that's because when I compose, I sit down at the piano and I play what I hear. And it happens, what did he say in German? Oh God. Einsammlung, all at onceness, tout ensemble. It happens all at once. What's it in German? Yes, thank you. That was it. Zum. And it was all there. And he says, whence it cometh from, I know not, but I thank the good Lord. It is at least Mozartish. You know, and then it all come out. Well, you know, Beethoven said the same. Wagner said the same. Paul Klee talked about these images coming all at onceness. So it's as if you have a skill, a high skill that you really perfect, and you also have that access to that state of deep resonance, then it is as if one is always partnered, partnered by the universe, yearning to enter into time. Such an extraordinary universe we have. I mean, we are that incredible, intersection between biology and cosmology. And the depths of being are only a microsecond and a micrometer away at any given moment. And there are societies that have known that. What we have to do is, what is it in French? Renvoyer says, remonter le pont de la pensée, remount the slope of thought, which is something that has been, I think, a key and critical form and practice of the Theosophical Society, the remounting of the slope of thought.